One thing that needs to happen right away is the back of the standing figure needs to be pushed out to widen it. I'll often refer to dimensions specific to a certain view, and I think we'll do that here in order to keep the language crisp and clear for everyone. So the front is going to be the primary view, and from the front, width from the side is depth. Thus from here on out, I'll call width from the side view depth. Width always refers to width from the front and the back, of course, and heights are heights no matter where we observe from. So I'm actually not adding width to the side, I'm adding depth to the side view of the figure. So here we have essentially what is a reversed relationship in terms of the pour of the pelvis and the ribcage compared to most standing poses. Most people, when they stand, will have this sort of pour take place, and most people, when they sit, they will sort of slouch a bit and they will have this pour take place. And you can see how the two are different. Is the opposite possible? And perhaps not even that rare? Yes, absolutely. If you sit upright, if you will have much more of a standard standing pour relationship between your pelvis and ribcage. Now, since Christmas break, I'd say that a little less than half of the standing poses our students have been working on have had the latter poor relationship between the pelvis and the ribcage, the one that's more commonly associated with seated figures, even though their sculptures are standing. Since the shoulders are placed in height, this gives us a decent starting point to locate the scapulas from the side view. The scapulas need to have a certain size to them in relationship to everything else around them. A typical one that tends to work out and is fairly standard is that they're close to as tall as they're wide, and that there is one scapula's width in between the two scapulas more or less. So in other words, if you know how wide your shoulders are, you can find the height and the width of your scapulas quite easily. When the pour of the ribcage and pelvis is such as it is here, we're going to see a lot of the ribcage impact the back of the figure while having less of an impact on the front. This is going to make the front seem a little bit flatter, especially sort of around the abdomen section, and more square, if you will, compared to if the relationship of the pour was reversed. The back becomes rounder and bulges out more, seemingly, when standing like this as well, sort of like a cat that's shooting its back up and out. And you can just stand in the mirror, look at yourself, and do this, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. The raised fist raises an interesting dilemma that I'm currently not sure exactly how to solve. I really want the gesture of the raised fist to ensure a contained composition, as I'd like to call it. So what do I mean by a contained composition? Notice the right hand of the Pietà Bandini by Michelangelo here. On the left hand side of the screen, you'll see his right hand. Notice how it's turned inwards at perhaps an angle that's a little sudden or tense or looks a little bit too intentional for somebody recently coming off a cross. This hand being at such a strong angle leads our eyes back into the composition, as opposed to if the angle was less severe, where the hand would lead our eyes out of the composition and into space. I'm a really big fan of these contained compositions, but it does pose challenges when you have an arm raised into the air like we have here. Action poses doesn't necessarily lend themselves so well to this contained composition idea all the time. How do you pose the hand, for example, to create a similar effect of a contained composition without sacrificing the believability of the pose itself? In this version, I do think I sort of messed it up pretty badly and chose a gesture that doesn't make too much sense for what's taking place, at least to me. However, it does complete the goal of making the composition more contained from certain views at least. But I don't like it because it looks weird and doesn't make any sense really. I'm really not sure how to solve this riddle as we scale the figure up, but we'll come up with something. What I do know is that instead of having a closed fist, we're going to have the standing figure holding a stone. The stone being the oldest tool man ever used and probably also the oldest weapon, speaking to the universality of what's happening in this composition. Fights and wars are as old as time itself, it seems. The stone as weapon is also a nod to Michelangelo's first sculpture, or at least the first one that we still have, which is called the Battle of the Centaurs. The story here is that all the characters are attending a wedding, and the wedding sort of goes off the rails, let's say. Somebody gets drunk, a fight starts, etc, etc, etc. I don't quite remember the details. But as you can see, all the characters are nude, which seems strange when you're attending a wedding. They probably weren't nude. At least they're not nude, I believe, in the story. And they're all fighting with rocks and not with weapons, which also seems like it probably wouldn't be the case. Where did they get all these rocks in this wedding? Well, who knows? Maybe it was an outdoor wedding. I don't know. But I'm a huge fan of this idea that a sculpture can transcend time in terms of what is displayed in the work. If the Battle of the Centaurs had weapons and armor, it would place the sculpture in a specific time, and it would sort of lock it into a specific place, if you will. Sometimes artists would use contemporary clothing and accessories and thus place their work not only in the time and place depicted, but also firmly in their own time, in the time that it was made, depending on the type of clothing that they chose. This is certainly very typical for a lot of, say, Renaissance or Baroque religious work, where they will wear contemporary dress, but supposedly they're characters from thousands of years ago. Which seems a little far-fetched, perhaps, but that's how you made sure that people felt like they could relate to the characters that they were seeing in these paintings. So it makes sense to do so. And I'm not against this idea. I just think that I prefer the more universalist approach of Michelangelo, where the figures rarely can be placed in time and space, but inhabit a concept raised above time and space. The sculptures tell a universal story, not rooted anywhere except the human consciousness. Perhaps the human spirit even, if I might say so, without sounding too Floaty McBodie. Thus, the sculptures, and I would like my sculptures to do the same, say something about what it means to be human on a universal and eternal timeline. Let's talk a bit about the origin of the design, since it might seem controversial to some to be sculpting something designed by somebody else, Michelangelo, or to sculpt something so close to a design by Michelangelo, rather. So the story goes that Michelangelo was hired to produce a sculpture of Hercules that was supposed to stand next to his sculpture of David outside the Palazzo Vecchio here in Florence. This commission, however, was never completed by Michelangelo due to various circumstances, and instead it was done by a man named Baccio Bandinelli, a contemporary of Michelangelo. His sculpture of Hercules and Cacus is still standing there outside the Palazzo Vecchio. Michelangelo, while on the project, produced drawings and some maquettes, or bozzettos as they're known in Italian. Maquette is French, but they both mean, bozzetto and maquette, they both mean the same thing, they mean 3D sketch. One of those can still be seen in Casa Bonarotti here in Florence, though the attribution is still debated, both in terms of if it is Michelangelo and if it is a maquette that was made for this Hercules project. I couldn't tell you in detail what the sculpture is in terms of theme, it's two people fighting each other, or what its purpose was, but I can with fairly strong conviction say that it was a Michelangelo, that it is a Michelangelo just by looking at it. Well, that's my very non-expert opinion, anyways. The surface must be finished, and we're going to run through a technique here that I use often when working in oil-based clay. First, we're going to use a buffalo alcohol torch to slightly melt the surface of the clay. This creates some nice textures and softens harder edges. It also makes the surface shiny in a nice way that I like. It can blend some stuff together a little bit, but it is slightly random, so perhaps keep that in mind. The next step is brushing talcum powder onto the surface. Wait until the sculpture cools down after the previous step before starting this step for sure. The talcum powder functions as a slight abrasive and polishes the surface ever so slightly, leaving us with a very even finish but without removing or ruining any of the details currently here in the sculpture. I use a softer brush here so no brush marks are made in the clay. The talcum powder is then brushed off and finally washed away with water. And I use the same soft brush to apply the water. Because this is oil-based clay, water has no effect on it, so you don't need to worry about that. The surface left after this treatment is one that I find very pleasing visually, and it's also very nice in terms of making sure that the silicone and the clay don't stick to each other when making the mold. The surface after these steps is very dry, and the clay seems firmer or harder in a way. Very little clay residue is going to be left in the silicone, which is of course a huge bonus, as it leaves us with much less cleanup to do. What did we learn from making this maquette then? What is going to be different when we work at the next scale up, which is going to be twice the size of the sculpture? First and foremost, height to width ratio of the overall composition. This sculpture is too wide compared to its height for my taste. This will be solved by making the scale difference between the figures greater, the standing figure being at a larger scale compared to the reclining figure, for example. This will make the composition taller in relationship to its width. That's it for this month's video. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you learned a thing or two that you can take with you into your own practice from this video. Please let me know what you thought about the video in the comments below, and until next time, stay creative.